Sorry, James, I don't know if I'm the only one, but I can't hear you.
No one you can't hear me?
Am I the only one?
Hopefully everyone can hear me. Could someone give me a reaction that they can hear? Cool, thanks Karen and Tim. Welcome to the last, number 5 of our the talks that have been hosted by ICOMOS and Historic Places Aotearoa. Welcome today to you all. So today our speaker is Susanne Rawson, who spent her formative years in the southern USA, where she developed a deeper appreciation for the historical and social influences of coastal environments on identity. Through her work as a cultural materials conservator and PhD candidate, she strives to acknowledge Te Ao Māori and reshape heritage practices to incorporate public interactions with the past. Her work is shaped by serving in many roles related to cultural heritage preservation, material culture, and archaeology, including non-profit, education, and private practice environments with a variety of materials and in locations from the Arctic to the Antarctic, South America, and across the Near East and Asia and Africa. So talk today is findings from a study of community relationships with underwater and near water heritage in Taranaki. Just a reminder, we can hear you, Susan. Just a reminder, if people have questions, to please go to slido.com, and the password today is HB5. So I'm now going to pass over to Susan. Hopefully she can hear us and she can share her screen. And before she shares her screen, she was going to give us a little talk about the workshop and the environment she's in there. So
thank you. Awesome. Thanks so much, James. Sorry about that. Thank you guys, everybody, for joining today. In the background here, so we have a commercial studio space for conservation work of heritage and cultural materials in New Plymouth. And we moved in here about a year ago, and we've just started gathering momentum and staff. And we've got a great team now that's really bringing in a lot of energy to the studio space. But behind me is a controlled climate room. This is for some special tonga that we're caring for at the moment. It's actually a marijuana grow room. So if you're looking for alternative income streams, it's a great way to, I'm just kidding. It is a grow room, but it's perfectly insulated for artifact storage. And then we've got a disaster project where there were some documents that had been exposed to a roof leak over some time, and they became moldy. So we've got a mold booth here. You can see one of Tammy's in there. She's cleaning some of the moldy documents at the moment. So we had a public archaeology night last night in honor of Archaeology Week. So we've got some artifacts out on the table here that our local archaeologists have excavated and were able to share with the public last night. So that's really exciting that this space can be a community space as well as a workspace, and we've got big ambitions for it, but that's not why you're here today. So I'll just launch in just to verify. James, you can hear me okay, and everybody else can hear me okay. Cool, okay. Let's see, so I'll jump into screen sharing. See where my PowerPoint is. Here we go. Excuse me while I find it. I should have had it pulled up faster. There we go. Cool. Great. I know many of you are familiar names and some are new, so that's exciting. I always enjoy a chance to share my research, so I appreciate that. Right, looking okay so far, James? Great, okay. As James introduced, tēnā koutou katoa, ko Susanne Grieve, toko ingoa no Florida au ke kaitiaki for tonga au Mahiana. So I was a new immigrant into Aotearoa working as a heritage professional back in 2015, and I started to make these observations about the condition and interpretation of sites just locally, and I began this doctoral research journey to discover that my expectations about heritage in New Zealand were much different than the realities. And I think a lot of immigrants come to New Zealand from really strong heritage models, strong heritage legislation, and expect to be able to apply those same principles and processes here. And I didn't want to essentially come in with my red cape on to the community and say, I'm here to save your heritage, when I didn't know what they wanted. And so this whole process has made me question my identity, really my professional views, my ethos, et cetera. So I started the doctoral program in 2017, had a few breaks here and there, but as I said, I'm in a private objects conservator just in my professional life. And we have a huge variety of clients, museums, public, community groups, and settled in Taranaki, which is unusual. We don't have conservators in this area other than myself. I've got a colleague in Cambridge and a colleague in Palmerston North. As you all know, you're probably well versed in the conservation community, but those are the two closest conservators. So we really do have quite a unique opportunity within Taranaki. And a lot of our community doesn't want artifacts or tonga to leave the rohi. So it's been important to be here, actually, which I didn't really understand so much being an immigrant. So this research is kind of largely focused on the Taranaki region. I will just move the slide, see if I can do that efficiently. Here we go. Really, it's about a broader theme across the country, but a lot of what I'll talk about is Taranaki specific. But for those, I don't know where people are joining in today, but for those who are not familiar with Taranaki, it's located on the west side of the North Island, and it's most kind of historically known for the Taranaki land wars, or excuse me, the New Zealand land wars, the peaceful resistance at Parihaka, and the iconic song Poye, which was performed by the Patia Māori Club. So nowadays, however, we have huge agricultural industries, petroleum products, and then more recently our renewable energy schemes. So this really extensive coastline is really critical historically, and it remains really critical today to economy, subsistence, and tourism. So a desktop survey that the Taranaki Regional Council commissioned about 9 years ago was completed by archaeologist Andy Dodd, and he identified about 180 maritime related sites around Taranaki. So many of them are associated with New Zealand European history, and this is just kind of due to their prominence in the historical records. So I'm just going to click through some examples. So this is the SS Gerlach, which is a super popular picnic spot for people in the summer. Not much left of her now, but it's nice to envision the romantic notion that she was. Tauranga Waka, a Waka landing site. This is a PA site along a river locally. This PA is most well known for Pukerengi PA is a dock site, a dock reserve, and the warring iwi factions, the incoming iwi faction pushed the resident iwi faction off the edge of the cliff. So it's pretty emotive when you're standing at the bottom of this cliff and you appreciate the decision that they had to make to jump or perish at the hands of another. Also, we have petroglyphs, not well known along our waterways. A World War II pillbox, which is a super fun one up in Waitara, machine gun emplacement along the river. So people don't often think of these as kind of being underwater or near water heritage, but the deterioration factors are what designates them as being different from those who might be a bit further inland. So when I started to speak with other professionals, I really came to understand that the current condition of the sites is unknown, and a lot of the sites are not protected from damage or loss, and just under New Zealand heritage legislation, and even when they are protected, unlisted, they're not protected. So in my thesis, I argue that underwater and near water heritage, as I call it, is not actively managed in Taranaki, and as a result, it's undergoing damage and destruction by natural and human elements. Some of them are listed here. So heritage professionals, we can assist in identifying and preserving these heritage sites, but our resources are limited, and it's really necessary to understand community relationships with those heritage sites to implement successful practices, to engage with stakeholders successfully. I wanted to know how people felt about tangible heritage. So in this next slide, no one's waving their hands, so things look like they're going swimmingly, James. Is that right? Okay. So in this research, I really defined communities as those groups or individuals that have a vested interest or experience with underwater or near water heritage in Taranaki or broader. I selected representatives from the 8 recognized local iwi. I talked to avocational groups. I understand avocational is not a term widely used in New Zealand. I really mean collectives of people that are just passionate about maritime history, but they might not have that academic or professional training. I talked to business owners, local residents, managing agencies, professionals, and recreational or sporting groups. So overall, I conducted 35 interviews with all of these communities being represented in one facet or another to try to get as wide of a range of perspective as possible. And this was very revealing. It revealed that how we define communities as researchers has to be really understood in the context in which they exist. So I guess what I'm trying to say is when I talk about community in this presentation, I'm really referring to the groups or individuals that represent these categories of people that have a vested interest. So one of the very first things I discovered is that words are important, terms are important. And it was a huge challenge in the way that we collectively professionals use terms or words or jargon. And the 3 terms that stood out as problematic that were pretty central to the interviews were heritage, conservation, and managing agency. So you would think that they would be core to this type of research, and they were. However, no one's commonly using the term heritage outside of those who kind of practice in this subject in my community. Māori are not using that term in the same way that Pākehā are using the term. Managing agencies, some of you may be on the call now, do not see themselves as managing agencies. No one was comfortable with that phrase. Meant responsibility maybe. And additionally, other communities, such as avocationals, they didn't see themselves as avocationals. They kind of felt like they were more professionals, and oftentimes they did professional activities. So it was hard to find these boundaries to these communities. And I discovered that I invented these communities. I assigned them identities that were not reflective of kind of how they saw themselves. So that was really revealing for me. And then lastly, of course, preservation, conservation, restoration, these are all terms in the heritage profession, and we can see they have different meanings based on your geographic region, your professional perspective, your material specialty, etc. But within Aotearoa, the term conservation to the general public is just popularly and dominantly applied to the natural resources conservation. And that's just through the success of DOC's public relations programs and so on. So it really occurred to me that the public has an already high association of the term conservation to the natural resources. So I used throughout my research the term preservation, although you all might not agree on that. But so I had to consider that everyone's not going to share the same definitions that I did through my professional lens. And that has resulted in me changing the way that I speak to communities now when I speak to people outside the profession. I often use the term care instead of conservation, and I use the term consideration instead of recommendations, just to kind of eliminate that expert-driven perspective. So the first aspect I researched was relationships. While my research question is causal, I argued that the community relationships with the preservation of these sites really influences our professional heritage practices. So I really wanted to understand what are those relationships. So I'm just going to share a few here because I'm limited on time, but these are the ones that are kind of the most revealing to me. For all communities, there were some similarities in their relationships and their views of heritage. So people seem to find some common value to underwater and near water heritage sites, mostly because it is historical, however you want to interpret that. People use it. It's on a list somewhere, so it must be important, right? And the agencies have to manage it, so it must be important. Other people value it, it's important to them, therefore it's important, which is really good to have that empathetic perspective. And there's also still things to learn about New Zealand's history, and gosh, we just see that with the new curriculum coming in, don't we? And then lastly, just because it exists, it's survived, it deserves to be preserved. So there's some really fun, common things that people see in heritage sites such as these. And for personal connections, there was some commonalities in those, including storytelling. People enjoyed being able to listen to the romantic aspects of shipwrecks and so on. I'll be doing a presentation on shipwrecks for Heritage New Zealand Puwhiri Tonga in next week, I believe, if you're interested in that topic. Ancestry, whakapapa, people shared that common idea that their ancestors came over on a boat. Childhood experiences, numerous interviewees talked about as children how they just enjoyed that maritime environment with their families. Of course, New Zealanders have a very unique connection with nature, so that's primary in their association with heritage sites in an outdoor environment like this. The idea of being at these sites provided this kind of sense of community, mainly for people who are fossicking or metal detecting. And that's really important. It's not something that we might be familiar with as professionals, but that for them is really important in their identity to have that connection. And then, of course, the ritual of collecting too. So those were some fun things that came out of that. I mean, some of them are predictable. We know this based on other research, but then some of them we just know personally as well, how we connect with those sites. For Māori communities, this is a little different. The relationship that they have with the natural world is really visceral. The interviews with these iwi representatives reinforce the philosophy that many Māori communities feel being a part of nature through whakapapa. I did want to highlight 3 additional insights, though, that are worth discussing. I'm really skipping over all of the ethical challenges and personal reflections that I had in interviewing Māori communities, but that could be a whole thesis on itself. So the first is that the value of wahi tapu and wahi tupuna is not diminished when the physical remains deteriorate. And so often Pākehā perspectives towards these archaeological sites are generally that once those kind of physical remains on the surface deteriorate, there's less awareness, less importance. Things are built on top, roads are paved, stock are grazed. But for Māori, objects, sites, and landscapes really inherit that energy, that respect, that power of the people that live there, even assigning some mori or spirit to it. I think when the physical remains deteriorate, the land still holds the value of that history, and that's really critical in Māori identity development. I also felt that when often working with other types of Indigenous societies, there's an awareness there that cultural materials should be returned to the earth through this process of deterioration. And this, in some cultures, this allows the spirit to be released, right? Deterioration is a desired and part of the natural process of materials on our planet. But while there are similarities in Te Ao Māori to other Indigenous societies with those kind of non-Western belief systems, the reflections that I had from iwi-related participants really demonstrated this philosophical grounding towards a desire for preservation based on historical social injustices rather than their relationship with the natural world. So in summary, preservation of Tonga is necessary because it's proof of existence for Māori. It's proof of their history, and there isn't that much there, so historically. So it became more about a response to acknowledging their past. And then one thing that was revealing to me was about how iwi can be responsible for Pākehā heritage sites. So there's 2 case studies in our region, or in Wanganui and Taranaki. The first is the Cape Egmont Lighthouse. This is a picture of it here. And this was returned to Taranaki iwi in the Treaty of Waitangi settlements. So the Cape Egmont Lighthouse, not to be confused with the historic Cape Egmont Lighthouse, we have 2 in very close proximity to each other. It confuses people often, is very iconic on the coastline, and lighthouse loving tourists love to come and photograph it and photograph the moon and the sun around it. But so you could say it's kind of important to the locals, but it was handed back in the treaty settlement. So when the iwi was approached about what they would do to preserve it, their perspective really was to do nothing. It'd been this symbol of oppression. It was literally constructed on some of the most sacred lands and where the bloodiest battles took place. And this is described by Rachel Buchanan in her essay Illuminations. So good dichotomies of desires for outcomes of preservation there. And then the second case study is in Opunake. We have a courthouse that was returned in a settlement as well. And the preference may be from the iwi to knock it down. It's a physical location where this confiscation of Maori land was decided. So you have a complicated layering of history, which I did not fully understand as an immigrant professional coming into the field. So another aspect I considered was the management of underwater and near water heritage. So I argued that they're not actively managed, and as a result, they're being damaged. So I define management as this process that coordinates people and systems to achieve an outcome. So for heritage management, that's often related to the promotion of significance of objects, documents, traditions, sites, etc., to ensure that age-old impossible mandate of access and preservation. It can also be an interactive process that documents, measures, protects, conserves, remediation, or it can be a passive process that administers and educates. So through the interviews, I learned I've highlighted some basic outcomes here, that there's really mixed perceptions of the conditions of the heritage sites. However, most people felt that they were in very poor condition, or I have here poor, to average condition in a scale. So there's an acknowledgement that our heritage sites are not doing well, even just from the public. There's a lot of confusion between managing agencies in who is responsible for managing these sites, and there are tensions between managing agencies and the other communities and how they're preserved and managed. Sorry, I got that a little out of order, but there's a lack of, so really how that resulted in the findings from the thesis is how this kind of lack of active management is leading to the destruction of heritage. And that's a result from minimal protection in the legislative system. That's a result of passive management. We don't know that any of these sites in that desktop survey are still existing. So there's not it's informational preservation at the most basic. And that is leading to the destruction of knowledge, not having more information about what condition they're in. This kind of shared governance between iwi, between managing agencies, which are councils. I didn't explain what a managing agency was, apologies, but councils and Heritage New Zealand, Ministry of Culture and Heritage. There's very much a passing of the buck, and that creates just a huge void in protection for sites. And as we know, as heritage professionals, there is a lack of enforcement when sites are damaged. And that just sends a message to people that the existing systems don't matter, or the developers can just pay the penalty and move on with the development, right? So also revealed was about where heritage professionals fit in. So I believe that we can create a space for this conversation. We can provide opportunities for communities to engage with heritage. Having our archaeology night last night was really one of those opportunities. We can assist managing agencies in prioritizing their resources and understanding the condition of the sites, and just having a maintenance procedure for that. Significance is actually a word that even people in my own community who work with heritage items aren't really familiar with. So a lot of my conversations are just talking about what significance is and how you can use that to make decisions. So we can assist in determining significance of things. Most of the participants I interviewed agreed that we should not try to save everything. There should be some sort of selective process. But it was also very revealing that participants said there's nothing we can do to save heritage sites. And I guess it's just the eternal optimist in me, but this is another way for professionals to contribute. There are numerous methods for intervening in the process of deterioration. Granted, some require more resources than others, but we can always do something, whether that's a scale of informational preservation all the way up to full-scale remedial treatment of something. And then just lastly, heritage professionals can be a bridge in this communication between the public and our ivory tower of academics and managing agencies, dare I say. So, right, where does that leave this thesis? I'm in my last chapter of writing, and I really struggled with how am I going to change the world, right? And it highlighted several things. One is this notion of authorized heritage discourse introduced by Laura Jane Smith. If you're in the field, you would have maybe come across this phrase. It's really about who has the authorized voice in caring for and managing heritage and interpreting heritage, et cetera. So this interview process really highlighted those power imbalances and who's holding the power in caring for our heritage. Another thing that it highlighted is community engaged research. I was very intimidated to talk to Māori communities and do research involving Māori communities. I had Pākehā paralysis, and it was not something that I was comfortable going into. But as a heritage professional practicing in this country as an immigrant, it was completely necessary, right? It was unethical for me not to understand this community more. So this thesis gave me the opportunity to engage with community, engage with Māori communities, but it was not community-based research. I didn't go to iwi or communities and say, what can I do for you as a researcher? So I engaged with the community to try to understand them better. And if you want to say for my own agenda, to try to be a better professional and give back and offer back to the community the services. But it highlighted some of those challenges too. And then lastly is Actor Network theory. If you are really into theories, this was a really fun one to talk about how each of these factors, each of these communities all interact with and are influenced by different actors. So heritage is a main actor, but not the only one. Excuse me. And so this theory I explore more in my thesis, of course, but that was one of the main things that came out of it, is that it's all these little factors and communities are influenced by each other. And the result is, I guess, the model of heritage management we have today. So this thesis, more than anything, this is something I love to stand on my soapbox about, is really expose the future of heritage in this country. So what is the future of heritage in New Zealand? It is in the community. It is not in government agencies. It is not in universities. It's not in research centers. The future of heritage in our country is in the community. They have got the resources. They have got the knowledge, technical knowledge. They've got the financial backing in some cases. We see that recently with the Daring shipwreck. I'll talk about that in more detail next week, but they're a passionate group of maritime enthusiasts that came forward and rescued the Daring shipwreck off of Muriwai Beach a few years ago. And she's now sitting in Mungawhai. So I just say that really the future of heritage in our country is going to be community driven. And as professionals, we all need to learn how to work better with communities. So where does that leave the thesis again? Right, how am I actually going to give back to the professional community? I really thinking about how someone said to me, good on you for holding space for these conversations. And I really was like, oh, what does that mean? I've never held space before. Like, what does that, what a responsibility do I have? What does it mean to hold space, et cetera? So I've been playing with this idea quite a bit. And just really recently, I had a big breakthrough. I had to I have to create this model for practice, but I didn't realize that this PhD research has so much affected me in my professional practice that I'm living the model. Like, we're implementing these changes in our studio. We're flipping this model. So on the right, I've just put this little triangle, right? It used to be top driven, the expert view of heritage and expert decision-making of heritage. And I don't even want to say that I'm trying to do a bottom-up driven model of heritage practice. It's meeting in the middle. And so it's a new way of communicating with the community. And in this studio, we're trying to flip that model. So we hold some iwi tonga here that we care for, and I had kaitiaki from the iwi come in, and we were discussing it, and they said, God, it's so cool to get to see what you guys do to care for the tonga. And I was like, oh, but we need to change that. It needs to be us on the other side of the glass looking and saying, isn't it cool what Māori are doing with their tonga? And not just being in the room at the bench. So that's something that we're kind of trying to work towards in our studio. And again, I've already mentioned that kind of idea of changing the language of how I speak to people and using less jargon. And that's really intimidating because, throughout my whole educational experience, it's been about jargon and how do we become the experts in what we do. So this is a really intimidating space to be transitioning through. But I just wanted to acknowledge the generous funding that I've had through Vic and my advisors, of course, and of course the whole community. So Namihi Nui, and thank you so much for being here. I appreciate your lunch break, and I'd love to hear more about your thoughts or reactions to that presentation.
Thanks, Susan. Remember, people, if you've got questions, please jump on the Slido. We've got one question there, Susan.
Great, I do see one. Do you want me to read it out, James, or would you like to? Yeah. Cool, okay, I'm just gonna put on the screen this one here. Right, so if heritage protection is led by the community, what would be the role of government agencies? Is it as a facilitator or supporter? Fantastic question. What's the role of government agencies now? I ask. They are proactive in providing ways to acknowledge heritage. One managing agency I interviewed is quoting as saying, "We administer the destruction of heritage." And I think that's a pretty strong statement. So that's really their role right now, is just administration. So when I talk about the future of heritage, I'm talking about the identification of heritage. A lot of people define heritage in different ways, but it's about finding sites that we didn't know existed. It's about working with iwi to identify their sites that they may not know existed, et cetera. It's not just about identification, it's about managing the site, ensuring that it is not deteriorating further. And it's about preservation, remedial actions, or informational preservation that can help retain the information.
You got another question there?
I do. Great. Yes. Cool. So how did you get over your Pākehā awkwardness with engaging with Māori? Is there a positive engagement collaboration process you ended up using? I think for me, a big part of it was putting my ego away. Like, I had to be seen as the expert. I had to be seen as someone who's going to be known for maritime heritage conservation. And just acknowledging, I really felt when I started the thesis that I owned the information in the thesis. And God, I should know better, right? I've been in this field for over 15 years, but it took studying New Zealand culture for me to understand my own blindnesses and upbringing. So I got over it by acknowledging my ego, putting it away, and not having to have the power in the relationship. And it makes me sound really egocentric, but I think you can understand what I'm saying, that it's a vulnerable space to go into a community that you're not familiar with the protocols, the language, etc. But just saying, I'm going to accept that I'm new to this, I'm going to be open to learning. And they read that energy. And the Māori community has been so supportive of what we're doing here, because as they always say, we come to it with good intention. So I think that's been a big part of it, is being authentic. My business partner, Sarah from Cambridge, Sarah Ginsford, sorry, and we work with the ministry together. And that's a big part of our mihi when we meet new iwi and hapu, is to say, this is who we are, this is our perspective, and we want to learn from you too. So gosh, that conversation goes so far at the beginning. Yeah, so is there a positive engagement collaboration process? Again, I think just going back to that idea of the space as a community space, it's an opportunity for people to talk about heritage, interact with heritage, and use new words. Just great audience.
Yeah. Another question for you. What were some of the concepts of what heritage was? You know, you were saying that there's differing views on what defines heritage. What were some of the thoughts, you know, the feedback you got from the people you interviewed? Like, what is heritage to some of the
I mean, heritage is not even a word that I can find a translation for in Te Reo. I'd be very interested to hear y'all's thought about that, for Māori communities in particular. But for Pakeha communities, like they disagreed on what they saw was heritage. 90% of the people that I interviewed were like, we can't help you. I don't know anything about your topic. I don't even know what that means. And it was really disconcerting because I particularly picked these communities because I thought they had a vested interest in it. So to start the conversation with them, and then it turns out that they are the best informants. They interact with maritime heritage almost on a regular basis, right? So I guess they thought heritage as something different, and there's a lot more to unpack there. It was totally unexpected to have that result in the thesis, so I haven't investigated it further. But one example is in a group conversation with a kayak recreational group. About 10 people, and they all disagreed on whether this steamship was a heritage item or not. Excuse me. And whether that should be part of New Zealand's history and interpretation of history, et cetera. So that's just an example of kind of how they defined a heritage item differently, even among themselves. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, I don't know I think we're out of questions at the moment. So on behalf of all of us, thank you very much, Susan, for your time today.
Awesome, thank you guys.
Look forward to seeing the results of your thesis. When are you looking to publish?
I'm hoping to finish, gosh, that's such a big term, finish. I realize it has many finish lines doing a thesis. I'm hoping to finish by August, get it submitted for review. So finish by the end of the year. Wish me luck, guys, because I really need it.
Fantastic. So thank you everyone for your attendance today. Hope you all have a fantastic weekend, and no doubt Mary will be in touch and let us all know where the recordings will be posted, and so that they can be shared widely. This has been a fantastic initiative, I believe, and hopefully later in the year, Mary and I have been had discussions already about doing this again. So if people have got some contributions or thoughts about what they'd like to hear about, or suggestions for speakers, please get in touch with Mary or myself. Otherwise, ka kite, and have a fantastic weekend, everyone.